All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about concrete examples and how we can use them to learn abstract concepts. So abstract concepts are those that exist only in the mind, so they don't have any physical form. So because of their abstract nature, these concepts can be particularly hard for students to grasp. I mean, things with a physical form like, blood pressure and mass and heart rate, those kinds of things, it's like, they're pretty easy to understand, right? Because we can explain them and they're kind of quantifiable, right? They're in physical form. But these abstract concepts are, again, just general ideas, you can think of them, right? So it's really hard because of their abstract nature. So what we can do is we can use concrete examples to help make them come to life, right? Make those ideas come to life. So instructors, a lot of times, just naturally tend to use a lot of examples. I think students appreciate that when they do. And a lot of times instructors will introduce examples in class to really highlight how the relevance of what students are learning. And a lot of times they'll also use those as the basis for exam questions, right? So it's really good to get used to being able to take a concept, try to understand it in its basic form, but then also look to see how I can figure out how I can identify some useful concrete examples that will help, make this ideas kind of come to life and be more concrete. So just as an example, I was kind of recently teaching a course and we were talking about different biases that can come into play when we're working with patients. And I kind of talked about this idea of confirmation bias, which is a tendency for people to focus on information that fits their current beliefs and maybe disregard information that doesn't fit their current beliefs. Again, this is an abstract concept. It's not anything that exists in physical form. So, when I explained that to students, they probably had a reasonable understanding of what I was talking about, but I followed it up with an example, right? I said, well, imagine, maybe you're the second person to see a patient, maybe the patient gets referred to you from a physician if you're a therapist or something like that. And the patient already comes in with a diagnosis. They've already been diagnosed with a certain condition. All of a sudden, when you do your exam, the exam findings that fit that diagnosis, you're probably going to highlight. The exam findings that don't fit that diagnosis, you're probably going to tend to neglect, right? Because it's basically confirming what you already suspected based on their incoming diagnosis, right? So again, we'll call that diagnostic momentum. And, obviously, just by giving the definition of confirmation bias in this particular case of diagnostic momentum, students probably couldn't fully grasp what I was talking about and how this would kind of play out in a clinical scenario. But by using an example, now all of a sudden I can take this abstract concept and make it more concrete and something they could understand playing out in their day-to-day, right? Now, when I went through these different biases, I also used different examples when I asked students exam questions to see if they understood these different biases we had discussed. I didn't just, on my exams, I didn't just put the definitions and ask students to identify, remember these definitions and then identify in the exam. I would give them a scenario, like an example, and then I would say something like, what type of bias does this represent? And the students would have to go through and check the right one. And again, that's where instructors a lot of times use examples for their exam questions. So as a learner, you want to leverage these examples to help make your learning these abstract concepts kind of come to life, right? And then it also sets you up well to answer those kind of pesky exam questions that instructors ask, where they want you to move beyond just being able to identify a definition and be able to think of, okay, if you're given a scenario, pick out what this, kind of explain what this actually represents, right? So when we use concrete examples, we're talking about specific real-life examples that learners can connect with. So again, my example of diagnostic momentum is a part of confirmation bias. Knowing I was working with healthcare providers, I tried to use that example because I knew that that would be able to connect with them. They could imagine, that scenario where they get a diagnosis and that kind of skewing or biasing their thinking a little bit, and then all the problems that creates. So it's kind of like it creates something a little more tangible for them, realistic, right? They can envision that happening, right? So it's kind of bridging the gap between something abstract and then something more familiar and relatable, right? So just an example of studies that have looked at the effectiveness of using concrete examples, Rawson did a study where they wanted to look at, do concrete examples help students learn psychology concepts, right? So you can imagine psychology, we're dealing with a lot of abstract concepts on a regular basis, right? So they had students either repeatedly read definitions, so they would read the definitions, kind of try to, burn them into memory a little bit, and then they'd have other students that would read a definition and then read an example or review an example, right? And then what they did is that they gave students a post-test, and they found that students who reviewed examples performed better on the post-test. And a lot of the post-test questions were kind of like the exam questions I mentioned earlier, where it wasn't just remembering the definitions, it was seeing if the students really understood the concept enough that they could pick out and explain it, or at least identify it when it was presented in a case, right? So why do examples promote learning? Why are these effective for our learning? Well, it's harder to remember abstract concepts because they aren't tangible by nature. Things that we can, that have physical forms like mass and blood pressure and some of the anatomical structures, right? We actually have a physical form we're learning about, so it's a little easier. Abstract concepts are just harder to remember because, again, they exist only in the mind. So concrete examples help us take abstract concepts and make them more relatable and thus more memorable, right? I also think it's kind of motivation for us to learn, right? Because sometimes when you're just listening to definitions of these kind of abstract concepts, you're like, okay, I'm not exactly sure why this matters. But all of a sudden, when you start to see how the applications to your real world and to life, you start to think of, okay, yes, this stuff does matter. It does play out in important ways in potentially my day-to-day, right? So I think it's a motivating factor too. So a few tips about how to effectively incorporate concrete examples. One is to work to create your own examples. Like I said, instructors a lot of times will provide you with a lot of examples. I think that's great. But you probably want to get to the point where you're not just able to kind of see their examples and they make sense to you, but actually be able to come up with some of your own. And you want to make sure that they're accurate and complete. So a lot of times I tell students, it's like, come up with your own examples, and then if you want, run them by me, right? And I think most instructors would be open to that. If you're putting in that effort to take the course concepts and come up with your own examples and stuff like that, they're going to be happy to, talk you through it and say, yeah, this is getting in the right direction, but it's not perfectly there. It's not fully complete. So, get some feedback, but that can be a great way to develop your own examples. And kind of getting to that third point, then take those examples and share and discuss your examples with classmates, right? Because you can learn a lot from hearing their examples, how they conceptualize that information, and obviously you'll get the benefit of, bouncing your examples off a peer, right? So that can be a nice, collaborative learning activity or group learning activity. The other thing I would say is have multiple examples for each concept. If you really understand a concept, you shouldn't be limited to probably just one example. You should be able to have a few examples, that you can kind of, because then it allows you to say, if you have multiple examples, you can say, well, what is the core thing that links all these examples, right? They're slightly different, but they do have this core feature that relates them, again, to this consistent abstract concept. So I always think, if you really understand something, you should be able to come up with multiple examples, or at least have multiple examples in your mind. So again, short talk, just because this one's pretty intuitive. I think as learners, we naturally tend to a lot of times seek out examples, which is great, right? It's effective, it's conducive to our learning, it's effective to help us learn, right? So this is one of those things where a lot of the stuff we've talked about, it's kind of like the stuff that tends to be good for our learning is the stuff that we don't tend to use automatically, or we don't tend to gravitate towards using automatically. Concrete examples are kind of the other way. They tend to be really effective for helping us learn, and as learners, we tend to want more of them. We tend to look for examples all around us to help make some of these abstract concepts a little more concrete. So again, the more we can make these abstract concepts essentially come to life and relatable, the more we're going to be able to make this information stick.
If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Learning That Lasts, and check out my book, Learning That Lasts, which is available on Amazon.